Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from Comcast, the Spencer family, Chevron, Community Health System, Harris Ranch Resort, Producers Dairy, Caleb and Desiree House, Valley Children's Health Care, and The Wonderful Company. Additional support provided by from the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's public universities. This is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zanti.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. California is often described as a superpower, as the fourth largest economy in the world. Joining us today is Dr. Markos Kounalakis to help us understand how California navigates its enormous global influence within the constitutional boundaries of the United States, foreign affairs and political dynamics in Washington and California. Dr. Kounalakis is an author, foreign affairs columnist, and a visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, a senior fellow at the Center on Media, Data, and Society at Central European University in Budapest, Hungary, and a senior research fellow at the University of Oregon, UNESCO Crossings Institute. Additionally, Dr. Kounalakis serves as California's second gentleman, married to Lieutenant Governor Eleni Kounalakis. Dr. Kounalakis, welcome to the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and thank you for everything that you and the Institute do. So you really make an impact on the state, and you certainly have a presence in the Valley that is important.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. We're honored to have you. Let's dive into our discussion. You've frequently described California as Superpower California, which you coined back in March of 2020. What's the significance of this term, and why is California a superpower?
So I work in international relations. I'm a foreign affairs analyst, and one of the things that I understand is power, and I research power. And so we often don't have a framework for looking at what we call subnational governance and governments. And they operate underneath the federal structure, or even in certain instances under a unitary structure. But they all have some level of power, often soft power, but in California's case in particular, there's a great deal of economic power. There's something we refer to as the California effect, which means policies that we promote and that we pass, laws that we pass in California, have an effect on other countries and other regions and other states. And the most obvious of those, for example, is our climate policies. The way that we regulate tailpipe emissions means that auto manufacturers don't just create and manufacture automobiles for California, but that they use our standards for vehicles all across the nation and even across the world, so that our market effect is so large, so important, that it has this knock-on effect across the world. So what Superpower California and my research tries to encompass is an understanding, to understand what those power resources are, and there are many, how they can be leveraged, and really, as a patriot and as an American, how those power resources can align with the policies and the foreign policy of the federal government, so that we're not working at cross purposes, but rather Washington can leverage the power and the approach that California privileges, while at the same time doesn't undermine policies and programs that California is responsible for, and really tries to amplify for its own population, but also for that of the rest of the nation.
And you just spoke on this, but maybe if you can touch on it a little bit more. Does California punch above its weight internationally? And even as we're kind of looking at the constitutional constraints within our federal structure, how does that dynamic come into play as a subnational government in the U.S.?
Yeah, so as you say, I did talk about it a little bit in terms of, for example, climate, where in fact our policies become amplified and really the de facto standards in other states and other countries. But it goes way beyond that. Yes, to answer your question, it does punch way above its weight. We are not a nation state. We do not have sovereignty. We don't have the ability to print our own money. We don't have a standing army. We cannot enter into treaty negotiations. Those are all things that are the responsibility and the power of the federal government. However, having said that, there's an awful lot more that California can and does do. It is rare, for example, to see the governor of another state other than California being received by world leaders in their capitals, in their presidential palaces, or even in international fora. We recently saw Governor Newsom in Davos. After that, he wasn't very much time that elapsed. He was in the Munich Security Conference, promoting those things that are within our purview, but also amplifying California's role, partnership, and abilities to engage globally. And I think that those are just a couple of examples of how we punch above our weight.
Thank you. Up next, we'll discuss how trade, tariffs, and international relations can affect California. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Dr. Markos Kounalakis about the impact of trade and tariffs on California's economy. Dr. Kounalakis, thanks for joining the Maddy Report today. We've seen how Washington tends to traditionally focus on Europe and the Atlantic rather than challenges and opportunities in the Pacific. What are the implications of this, and why should Washington also divert some attention to the Pacific? And also, why might events in the Pacific have impacts on trade and agricultural products right here in the San Joaquin Valley?
Sure, and this is really an important question because for a long time, and even to this day, the political weight and the orientation in Washington, D.C. and on the entire Eastern Seaboard has been on transatlantic relationships, whether they're trade relationships or otherwise. Also politically, the Middle East takes up an awful lot of attention in our policy organs in Congress and the Senate. And so while there is sometimes a tip of the hat to the importance of the Pacific, you can think back to Obama's so-called pivot, the rebalancing that was discussed, which has, recognition, at least rhetorically, of the enormous importance and strategic importance of the Indo-Pacific region, meaning population growth, meaning the size of the economic opportunity that exists there, but also recognizing the challenges that are arising, in particular from the People's Republic of China, to areas where the United States has been able to really lead and dominate in many ways that regional economic engagement, certainly since World War II. But all those things are either things that Washington is unable to take advantage of, to recognize, or to even confront in the case of adversarial actions, and because there are in many ways there's a level of inertia that exists in Washington, D.C., and an inability to change and to reorient on a dime. And so I hope that with my focus on Superpower California, that we can actually reorient that thinking. Ideally, we've had three Californians as president of the United States, and each of them has made sure to make that reorientation a part of their policy, whether it was Ronald Reagan, Richard Nixon, or Herbert Hoover. If there's a future California president, the expectation should be that that thinking will then be able to infect Washington, D.C. in a much more significant way.
And, you alluded to this in the previous segment, but how should California leaders navigate trade disputes when the state bears the economic consequences but lacks control over trade policy? And I know, for example, last year, the governor engaged with talks with private companies to give them incentives to do business in California to sort of combat some of the tariffs being imposed at the federal level.
Yeah, well, first, let me just say I'm very familiar, as is my wife, Eleni Kounalakis, with the Valley and agriculture. She grew up in Sacramento. She learned how to swim in the canals. I spent my summers basically going up and down Highway 99. my family had a farm in Livingston, 40 acres, and we grew milo, we grew grapes, we grew watermelons. And so we've had personally an understanding of the agricultural superpower that California is. And so when we talk about trade and we talk about California, we have to bear in mind the importance of our agricultural exports. This time of year, my recollection is when all the almonds are blossoming, and it's probably the most beautiful sight that one can behold in the Central Valley. Almonds, for example, make up an enormous amount of our export crops. And India, for instance, gets 85% of its almonds. It's $1 billion in trade with India. If you've been following the news, then you likely know that the Trump administration has had a head-to-head collision with India and its policies over trade. Guess which part of the country suffers? It's not the corn growers in the Midwest, it's the nut tree growers in California. Now, we've come to an accommodation. Tariffs obviously are one of the more disputed aspects of the Trump administration, knocked down on the one hand by the Supreme Court, but a pivot by the administration to something that's also hard to predict, very difficult to plan for. And when we talk about agricultural products in particular, there is a long lead time. It's not like they just close the factory and lay off the workers. You have to plant things, you have to water them. It takes a very long time to take something from a planting to a production. And so for agricultural growers in particular, the need for stability, predictability, whether it's in tariffs or in any other aspects of their market, it is key for their survival.
Thank you, Dr. Kounalakis. We're going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back after this. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. Issues abroad can often feel distant, and sometimes we question if they truly have an impact on California and in the San Joaquin Valley here at home. However, that couldn't be farther from the truth, as foreign affairs can have drastic implications for our state and region. Dr. Markos Kounalakis is here to break this down for us. Let's talk a little bit about some recent events. Recent expression by President Trump wanting to acquire Greenland from Denmark has pushed Democrats, including California Governor Newsom, to go on the offensive, even with Governor Newsom going on a European tour to Davos and to Munich. You talked about this a little bit earlier, but what is Governor Newsom hoping to accomplish for California through his involvement in Europe and abroad?
Well, I think you need to recognize, or people, Washington needs to recognize that California is also a border state, and we have a need for very positive relationships with our neighbor, Mexico, for example. Entering into a conflictual rhetorical environment, or even one that uses the force of arms, even through the threat of that use, and I'm speaking again specifically about Mexico and the threat from the Trump administration to, in fact, go in guns a-blazing in certain instances, is very destabilizing for the rest of the United States, but in particular for California. So we have equities when it comes to our international engagement. That's just on the border front. We have them in the Pacific as well. We have a very robust tech industry in California, dependent on semiconductors that are produced in Taiwan, predominantly by TSMC. Having an environment where our policies with the People's Republic of China and with Taiwan are uncertain, unstable, where the policies of the past are no longer necessarily being followed or relied upon to pursue a much more, what I should say is a more feckless policy, reliant on personal relationships and potential summits, makes things very unstable for the state of California and for the economy writ large.
Immigration policy is set by the federal government, and California really has no power to set that, set immigration law, but it does have power over how it responds. Is there sort of this odd dynamic right now between California and Washington, where California has a tremendous amount of influence, but still has to defer to federal authority? And is it more about how California responds in these sorts of instances?
You know, I hate to just put this just on California. During the Biden administration, Texas was the state that had the most challenge, the greatest challenge. And by the way, they've got a border that's almost 3 times the size, well, it's almost 1,500 miles, right? So our border pales in comparison to that of Texas. Texas Governor Abbott was constantly at loggerheads with the Biden administration and challenged federal power at almost every step. And that included on immigration policy. It included on border. I mean, they were building barbed wire fencing in the Rio Grande. And it also challenged the federal government on the deployment of National Guard in the enforcement of immigration policy. So I don't say that to be defensive, but rather to say that the administration in Washington can actually make a difference to how a state acts or reacts to the policies of the federal government. During a Democratic government, the state of Texas had problems with Washington, D.C. During this Republican government and Donald Trump's rule, California has an awful lot of problems. And you would say one thing, you called it the immigration policy. We have a non-policy when it comes to immigration. We certainly have a lot of executive action, but really Congress and the legislature has failed to come up with what we always refer to as a comprehensive immigration policy, which would probably solve a lot of these problems, but some people believe that they are politically expedient to have those conflicts. We in Texas and New Mexico and Arizona all suffer from a lack of consistency and a clear approach to what immigration should be, what a managed immigration policy should be, because we all benefit from that. One of the reasons why California is as powerful and as wealthy as it is because of immigration. We have been the beneficiaries of it, but nobody should believe that unfettered and undocumented immigration should exist, that we actually have to be able to manage and monitor this policy. And that's Democrats and Republicans alike. But we have to get to a point where we can solve this problem, come up with a unified approach, because California does not have the power to manage immigration, nor does Texas, despite its best efforts.
Thank you. We're going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back to wrap up our conversation with Dr. Markos Kounalakis. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Dr. Kounalakis, thanks again for joining us on the Maddy Report today. Before you go, I'd like to touch on what the future may hold as we look ahead for the U.S. and how the San Joaquin Valley might play a role. We touched on this briefly earlier, but as it applies to ag trade policy, what should the San Joaquin Valley really be watching in the future as it pertains to tariffs, trade negotiations, changes in global markets as we look ahead?
Well, it's always going to be a challenge for California as well as the San Joaquin Valley, because we don't have enough representation that has enough power within Washington, D.C. Now, there was a time when the Speaker of the House came from the Valley, and of course then there was an awful lot of power that accrued to McCarthy and to the Congress from the Valley, so that our policies and our interests could be reflected in the leadership. That's no longer the case. It is now back to almost what it's always been, back to a sort of pre-California normal. I mean, we had at one point the Speaker of the House and the Vice President of the United States were representing California and understood California. So as far as tariffs are concerned, we have not come to any conclusive moment here, because executive direction is really what's defining our tariff policies. So I wish I could say that I see on the horizon a solution to this, but all I see is a conflict between the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch when it comes to tariffs. The president feels that he has effectively absolute authority to use tariffs and taxation as a policy for his interests in foreign affairs. And so, what can I say? Hang on for the wild ride that's sure to come. The Supreme Court told him he couldn't do it, and he turned around and did something similar and maybe even more punitive at times. So we are not finding our voice in Washington, D.C., and our interests are not being fully represented.
And finally, just before we wrap up today, you talked about how California's had speakers, a vice president. We've even had former presidents decades ago representing us in Washington. What does smart leadership look like for California as we look ahead? A state with enormous power, but really no formal sovereignty within our federal structure. What does California have to do to position itself or maybe reposition itself, as you just stated, back in Washington?
Well, I think partly there can't be sort of this personal animus against us, our leadership, and our state as a whole. And I think that that's one of the things that's harming us at this point. I think there have been from a bipartisan perspective, leaders who understand the importance of California, that California, in fact, leads the nation economically, culturally, in terms of our agriculture. I mean, you can go down the list of ways that we are first. We're first in manufacturing. We have this enormous capacity for energy to be created within our own state. So I guess the thing that I hope for most and that I think will make the greatest difference is leadership that recognizes the relative importance of the state of California, understands how that power is both created, how that innovation is fostered, and how the state itself can be leveraged in the world, but in particular within the United States, for all of our benefit.
Dr. Markos Kounalakis, Foreign Affairs Analyst and Second Gentleman of California, thank you so much for joining the Maddy Report. It was a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure to be here.
And thank you for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, visit themaddyinstitute.org. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.